Welcome to today's first general session. As you see on the screen, Finding a Better Business Model. As you've heard through the conference, Opera America has a new strategic plan that was approved by the board and ratified by the voting members yesterday. It's up on our website right now. During the planning process, many people wondered aloud whether we could create a new business model for opera that improved on the precarious and pressurized way we currently operate. When it comes to questions like this that bridge the arts and business worlds, we turn to our good friend David McIntosh. David McIntosh is a strategy consultant, teacher, and futurist. He's participated in strategic planning efforts for many of our member companies across the country. He served for 6 years as a board member of Opera America, where he was a constant source of energy, inspiration, and occasionally fun. He has assured me that he will not be any fun at all today, so it is for a wonderfully low-key and turgid presentation that I ask you to welcome our dear friend, David McIntosh.
All right. I'm really appreciative that Mark invited me back to speak, because the last time that I was on the agenda with Maestro Domingo, some of you will remember, was in Atlanta in 2001, and I didn't show up. There was a family crisis. I had to bow out. Mark covered for me. I don't know whether the Maestro has forgiven me, but I appreciate being invited back to talk, and I was able, Mark, to find the speech, so we're ready to go. No, Mark asked me to look at finding a better business model. So we're going to talk some about what we mean when we say business model as opposed to business or innovation or innovating a business model or reinventing ourselves. There's a whole spectrum here of things that might be possible, that might be on your mind. What I'm going to do is talk about how people in the business world think about business models, think about reinvention, think about innovation, so you can put this in a context. Then after I've done talking, I'm going to get some of you involved, just to scare you a little, and we're going to talk about how these ideas might or might not apply to the companies where you're working. So that's the game plan. In the material for this, it said that you guys are facing remarkable stress, that low working capital, shrinking endowments, rising production prices. Mark said that the cost of opera is going up twice as fast as the CPI, and he said, well, when you look at the opera, well, he had various indices, I understand, but whenever anybody invents their own price index, it means trouble. It means they're making excuses. Herb Simon at Carnegie Mellon got a Nobel Prize in economics for, among other things, coining the phrase, or maybe proving the phrase, when something can't go on forever, it won't. That applies to me too, not to worry. So when we look at the economics, the opera index reminded me of what's going on with healthcare. Just to start you with a scare, healthcare right now is growing twice as fast as GDP. And what that means is sooner or later, it's going to catch up. Sooner or later, the GDP and the healthcare are going to be the same number. In 2022, at this rate, if nothing changes, 25% of the GDP, or in 2046, 50%, or in 2072, well, every dollar of the GDP will go to healthcare. Hopefully some of that will be for music therapy. But this is a very scary picture if it's going on. I ran the comparable numbers to see what the growth rate was for opera expenses. We're starting, fortunately, from a lower base. So opera is not going to catch up to be 100% of GDP. I actually ran the numbers here. This involved logarithms. It's going to catch up with GDP in 2260. So in about 250 years from now. I know that sounds like a long time. Well, to most of you, except some of you were at the opera last night.
sheet.
We're in an unsustainable situation. So if, I mean, granted, only a few of us will still be alive when we get to that point, but let's take the long view. Let's see what can we do to make the world a better place. How can we rethink the business that is opera so that we don't destroy the rest of the economy? So we need to think. Mark asked, all right, we want to talk about we need a new model. So I did some research. Oh, God. I meant to put the family-friendly one up. All right. Woo. When we talk about models, models mean a simplification, something that helps us to understand or to talk about or to begin work on, to visualize what we're going to do. So model cars are a good start. When we talk about business models, I don't mean just doing more of what you're doing. When I was talking to people or looking to see what people in the field are thinking when they say we need to innovate our business model, often they're saying we just need to do more of what we're doing, or we need to get the trustees to give us more money. That's incremental change. That's like Burger King saying we'll sell you a supersize. Now, they're used to selling you soda. They had the bright idea of selling it to you a gallon at a time, but they're still in the same business. That is not fundamentally a new business model. Similarly, it's not a new business model when people just get into a sideline of business. At the Metropolitan Museum in New York, fantastic gift shop. It's huge. It's beautiful. It accounts for 0.3% of the Metropolitan's revenues. So these little sidelines that people do, I'm not saying it's not worth doing, but that is not a change to the business model. So what does constitute a change to the business model? Well, the invention of the DVD, to me, this is not a business model change. It's technology, it's innovation, it's important, but it doesn't change the way money is changing hands. So I want you to think of business models as what it is, what's the structure that enables you to get enough money to keep doing what it is you want to do for as long as you're doing it. So that's a definition that works in the not-for-profit area. It's a definition that works in the corporate area. But what is it that you're doing that's going to function in a way that you'll get to keep doing it as long as you want? And that takes money. So if that's a business model, business models can be things like Amazon, brand new business model, right? Xerox, when the Xerox machine came out, that was a new business model, not just because of the technology. The technology was great, right? And I saw this black and white commercial from the 60s, and the point was the executive was sitting behind his desk, and his beautiful 8-year-old daughter comes in, and she can make a copy, which I thought, boy, is this really 60s advertising or what? Your secretary, who's as stupid as an 8-year-old, will be able to work this machine. But the machine itself was an invention, but the business model innovation was how Xerox sold it. At that point, they had this wonderful but very expensive piece of equipment, and they said, we need to reach the customer in a different way. So at that point, they used a direct sales force. They didn't sell it at the office supply store. They had their own salesman, because it's a big, expensive thing. And they didn't need you to put all the money up front. The Xerox machines showed up in everybody's offices because they were leased. Nobody needed to write the big check for a piece of equipment that they were a little afraid of. So Xerox had both the invention in the product, but then the business model invention in how they ran their business. All right, same story with DVDs. DVDs are great, but the business model innovation was Netflix. Netflix changed a couple of things that sort of destroyed Blockbuster. What they did differently, new product, right? Everybody had the new product, but they had a new way of doing their business, a new way of ordering it online, a new way of getting it in your hands. So it involved the post office instead of your own car. So even though the what was the same, the how was new, and the where was new, and also the how to price it was new. That they priced it not on a per view basis, but on a monthly membership fee. So of all the elements in what they call the value chain, they upended it. They said, we could do this and this and this differently. So that's a case where a newcomer came in and said, we can do this business completely differently. In some ways, it's easier for a newcomer to do it. They say that God was able to create the world in 6 days because he had no installed base. It wasn't an upgrade. And you are in a harder situation because you're trying to make changes to an existing vehicle. So let's look at vehicles for a second. Mini Cooper, is this an invention or business model innovation? It's an invention. It's great. It's cool. It's groovy. It's design. This is the equivalent of a new production, though. You know, I like it. I own one. But it's not changing the business involved. Here's an example that does change the business. Does anybody have one of these? No, this is the Tata Nano. So you can get it in India. It costs about $2,300 to $3,000. Let's try that again. $3,000. Now, how do you make this work if you're selling cars? Well, clearly it's small. You'll notice that the wheels are smaller than the motorcycle wheels. If you have really good eyes, you'll see that the wheels are held on by only 3 nuts. So you save money wherever you can. If you want to get into the trunk, you have to pull down the back seats and climb over. And all the panels that you see, there's a little bit of steel, but there's mostly plastic and glue. There's only one windshield wiper. They did include headlights. So there's all right, but this is something that is revolutionary in the way that, say, the Model T is revolutionary. That they had to rethink so many parts of the business model in order to make this offer work. Now, they're still working with some of their basic suppliers. So Bosch, the automotive supply giant, that's who's supplying the carburetor and the powertrain. So the car parts inside are made by car people, but just everything else got reconsidered. And so this is something that it's going to roll out from India and revolutionize the world. The price of it, $3,000, interestingly, is more or less what a Model T Ford cost in the 20s in constant dollars. That's basically the same price that a $290 Ford would have cost you in 1920. So they're going after a new market, selling to new people in new ways, but they had to change not just the product, but how they put it together. So these elements of what, of how, of where, these are things that you change when you're looking at business model innovation. I think it's going to be helpful if we can look at different types, because I clearly can't tell each of you, hey, here's an idea, do it. But I can give you a framework of where people are innovating and what different patterns are. So a framework that I have found very useful in working on innovation is thinking about who we're doing it for or with and what it is that we're doing. So you can look at it in terms of, you know, are you just introducing new products? And perhaps the Tata is like that. Are you selling an existing product to brand new customers, which takes a lot of change if you're going to make it work? Are you selling a brand new product to a brand new customer? That seems crazy, but we're going to talk about what makes that, what can make it work. That there's ways to do that wrong, but if you're focusing on what it is that you have that's special, maybe you can do something there. And then finally, can you have major business model innovation if you're just selling the old thing to the old customers? And I would say yes, but that's because it's a special case. If you're selling the existing product to existing customers, the change has to be farther upstream. Change has to be in how you're doing it, rather than what it is that's being sold. So those would be new processes. All right, so let's look at some examples. So first, here's an example of where you've got an existing company with an existing customer base, and they say, we've got this customer relation, we're going to sell them something new, something they didn't even know they wanted. So the Kindle. Are any people in this room part of the 3 million Americans who have Kindles? All right, we've got about a third of them in the room. So, you know, huge success over the last couple of years. Amazon was in the business of selling books online, and now all of a sudden they're selling hardware, you know, devices. It's not, in a classic business school case, it doesn't make sense. This isn't their core capability. Is it making devices or even importing electronics from Asia? That's not what people think of them as doing. But what they had is they had both an understanding of the customer, and they had a bond. They had a relationship with the customer. They had permission from the customer to offer this. So here's a case where by building on the existing relationship, they could sell a new product to an existing customer. Let's look at the opposite corner. So if we look at new processes, this looks like Brunhilde's nightlight, I realize. You've heard the Nucor steel story a million times, but what's relevant about it is they were selling the same product to the same people that were buying steel and iron products, but they revolutionized the industry by doing it a different way. They said, you know what, we can make steel that's good enough working from scrap instead of ore. That was it. That was the insight. And they started out making pretty bad steel and got better and better and better. But by selling an existing product to an existing segment, they really did revolutionize the industry so that as of even 10 years ago, their market cap exceeded US Steel. So by changing how you're doing it, you can upend your entire industry. Another example that you might not be as familiar with is beef, Iowa beef processors. I'm sorry about cartoons. I know it's gauche to use them in presentations. I had some pictures of hanging slabs of beef, and it reminded me too much of the 2002 production of Erwartung in Toronto, where we had the naked people rolling down the stage. So I went with the cartoon to be safe. All right, what Iowa beef processors did that was revolutionary was instead of shipping entire animals from Iowa, the home of corn-fed beef, to population centers, Chicago, the East Coast, they said, hey, we can do the butchering here in Iowa. This sounds the simplest thing in the world, but it changed the industry dynamics and who was big and who was successful. So they said, no, we'll do the butchering and boxing and put it freeze it and send it east here instead of sending the whole big carcass to the east. And as a result, they became the dominant player in the segment. So just by thinking, what is it people want, and then backing away from it, saying, I'm going to give them what they want. They don't need to know how I got there from here. That was the revolution. So we've talked about new products for existing customers, existing products to existing customers. New customers, if you're selling an existing product to new customers, why is that actually business model innovation? That's just good marketing. That's just saying we're going to take this and find people who want to buy it. In 1975, my sister Susan was a first-year student at Harvard Business School. And at the time, there were literally about 30 women in her class. One of them is now the head of the Small Business Administration. Susan runs a lefty blog. It was a small group, and there was some pressure of being the outsider. She had a marketing case, and the marketing case was for Gillette razors. And she was called on to make the presentation. The way they do it at business school is they come into the audience and they just ask you, okay, will you tell us about the case? Don't worry. Yet. So they asked her to make the presentation, what can we do to double the market size? And she said, we have a problem here, that men are the primary customers for this product, and they shave such a small percentage of their bodies. If we could just get them to shave their legs the way women do, we'll have tripled the market. True story, true story. The reaction that she got was not as kind as the reaction that you just gave me. And she had a full marketing plan. She said, no, we need somebody macho like Joe Namath to show that big guys, tough guys do this. All right, they sort of told her to go back to her National Organization of Women or wherever she came from and just leave the business to us. Well, imagine my surprise when I go onto the Gillette website recently and find this advertisement.
Taking care of the hair down there certainly has its benefits. You might say when there's no underbrush, the tree looks taller. Before you start, think about the unique topographical features under your hood. With the right tools, like a Gillette Fusion Power, and some common sense, you'll avoid putting your equipment at risk. First things first, trim, lather up with some shave gel, and ensure you're using a fresh blade. Pull your skin taut and as flat as possible. Don't exert pressure. Let the razor do the work. Use short, light strokes to minimize nicks, cuts, and scratches. Rinse often to keep the blade clear. Once satisfied, Rinse off, pat dry, and apply a moisturizer to keep the area hydrated and minimize itching. There you have it. Trimming the bush to make the tree look taller. Now go ahead, be adventurous, and have some fun.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
This raises a question of when is a good idea just ahead of its time? Fourth category to look at is new products to new customers. Now, your classic, business education would say that makes no sense. You have no credibility, you have no permission, you have no understanding. So why in heaven's sake would you try to sell something you're not currently doing to customers you don't currently have? Now, in the case of opera, this is good news all around because your share of the total market is a couple of percent, right, of people who show up. So you have this huge untapped market. And you're already doing something, but there's other things you can do. So if there are other products, services, whatever you can offer to customers that you might not already have, that's a huge market. But you have to think, what makes it make sense to do that? When does that make sense? Amazon, sell books, they sell hardware, they also sell storage. They also sell computing power too. So in late 06, they introduced Amazon Simple Storage. And this works the same way that Apple's Me.com works or the other online storage. You can store your stuff at Amazon for 15 cents a gigabyte per month. Why did Amazon get into this business? What permission did they have? They got into this business because they had a core competency. They had an expertise of running massive data centers. And so that was the skill that they had that enabled them to offer this. And by the last quarter of 2007, a year into it, there was more computer traffic going in and out of Washington, out of Amazon, for this service than there was for the book business. So this is where all the digital traffic is. They took a skill that they had and they said, what else can we do with this skill? So that's a pretty nifty idea. So we've got these where can you look for opportunities? You can look for opportunities with new customers and new products, old customers, old products, new and old. We've talked about where. The question now is, so how? How am I going to do this? What are some ideas? Saying that we should innovate your business model sounds nice, but it's, is it that practical? Are there things that we can do? Let's break this down into things you can do on the revenue side, on the cost side, and on the capital side. Notice how I'm doing all of these in a dollar-denominated way? That gets back to my original definition of business model innovation. It's not about the product. It's not just about putting something out there. It's about changing the way that you earn money, changing the reason that people give you money. One of the sad truths I've noticed in the opera world is that people forget that you receive money from folks unrelated to what things cost you. People give you money based on what they value, and they don't care about what it cost you. So it is important to focus, if you're thinking about business model innovation and not just creativity, not just making the next Mini Cooper, you have to think about how's this going to affect the flow of money. So I've got a bunch of ideas on things that you can do to get more money in the door. First, if you're wondering, I've copyrighted this. So. But there are some great examples of people, when I say much more, I mean doubling, I mean 10x. And that does require you to rethink what you're selling to whom and how. So here's some examples of where people have changed their industry dynamics by charging a lot more. Starbucks coffee. Who would have thought 10 years ago that you'd pay $3 or $4 on an average, on a daily basis for coffee? Well, by giving you coffee that was slightly stronger, slightly hipper, and gave you a sort of environment and a cushy chair, they convinced us, hey, I'll pay twice as much. So they doubled the price of a cup of coffee, and we drank the Kool-Aid. Disneyland. Everybody thinks Michael Eisner's a genius, and I do too, but for one reason. He showed up at Disney in 1983. First thing he did, doubled the price of the theme parks. So between 86 and 87, the price doubled to get into Disneyland and Disney World. And all of a sudden, Disney had all this cash flow, and he was able to do all the Disney magic. So, but it all started with just changing the price tag at Disneyland. Another great example, a little closer to home, producers. They were the first Broadway musical to break the $100 mark, bless their hearts. And they then tried to get into the scalping business with the, I forget the term, but like premier or preferred or their own sort of last-minute tickets. So instead of buying it from the scalper for $450, you could buy it from the show for $450. So that was a case of saying, well, I know that the average ticket price is this, but are there ways that we can charge some people much more money? Everybody complained, and what does the world look like 10 years later? A $100 theater ticket would be cheap. All right, so they found the opportunity. All right, charging more money, that's a very pleasant way to innovate your business model. Here's one that's a little harder, charging much less. Classic story is in calculators and computer chips. Texas Instruments in the 70s, some of you had some of these calculators. I see some nods there. And what makes it easier to see is it's bald heads that are nodding. Texas Instruments realized that they got better at producing the chips in these things as time went on. And they underpriced the competition. In fact, they were selling the chips in the calculators and also chips they sold to computer makers for less than it cost to make. Because they said, hey, if we can get that much more experience, our costs are going to go down just because we get better at it. They call it the experience curve. It's like the learning curve. They said, hey, let's just ride the experience curve down, and we're going to price it cheaper than today's price and drive everybody else out of business. And they had a pretty good run with it. I mean, this made them the dominant chip producer for about 5 years. So this idea of seeing ahead and pricing it not on today's cost, but on where you can end up, that was revolutionary. Another example of pricing much less was Henry Ford with the $290 car. Now, he did it in a couple ways. One was vertical integration, doing everything. 2 was just the mass of experience that drove the cost down. 3 was simplification, like the Tata Nano, just simplifying the car and what's there. He was actually very clever also in working with his vendors. So he would do things like have specs for not just what the car parts, the motors and carburetors were going to be, but what the packaging was going to be. So that he could use, in one case, the crates that some of the stuff came in as floorboards. So finding ways to work with his suppliers, sometimes with them, sometimes behind their back, but to ruthlessly drive costs down. And that made it available. Remember, he was paying his workers, what, $5 a day? So $5 a day, how long does it take to buy a $300 car? Make 25 a week, that's a month, that's 3 months you can buy a car. That was revolutionary. So finding a way to take so much cost out of the system that he could open it up to a completely new market, I hope there's a way you guys can do that too. All right, another way to think about pricing is to charge in a different way. Netflix, we said, instead of charging by the view or by the disc, charge by the month, that I become a Netflix subscriber. Another instance of charging in a different way is cable TV. Although in that case, the different way was it went from being free to being $200 a month. We have a lot of channels in my house. The idea of changing where the money's coming from, it's actually more complicated in this case because you're going from what had been a totally advertising-supported model to a direct pay model. So instead of the commercials paying for TV, you're asking the customers to pay for it. In your world, this is like the difference between asking your donors and your underwriters and your sponsors and your foundations to pay to getting the customer to pay for it. What would your life look like if you only had the money that came in the front door? Now, I know that's not going to be the case, but it forces you to think about how could we do this business if we were charging so much less for what we're doing. And then, once you get them, then it goes up and up and up and up. All right, so you can charge much more, you can charge much less, you can charge in a different way. Finally, you can charge for different things. So with the Rolling Stones charge money to get people to come out and see that they're still alive. Sort of like a reverse snuff film. A reverse snuff. the reason that touring is important, these guys don't need any money, and they're just doing it for the fun, but for most bands, touring has become the primary source of revenue. This wasn't the case 20 or 30 years ago. Why is touring important now? Because what they used to do, selling records, that business disappeared because you could make copies of music for free. So even if piracy isn't the issue, and I think it's less of an issue than the RIAA thinks, people's attitude about how much I'm willing to spend changed. So the amount of money that you can get from selling recorded music has just disappeared. Kevin Kelly is the guy who founded Wired Magazine, and something he said that I thought was so smart was talked about what do you do when it becomes free to copy. When you can make copies for free, he said, then you have to charge for what can't be copied. So at this point, they're not selling the music. They're not selling just the tunes in your head. They're making their money selling the experience, either the experience of being at the concert or maybe the experience of being able to tell people that you were at the concert. But what we're paying for is completely different. We're not paying for the music anymore. We're paying for the experience. So that can also be a mind bender, thinking, well, what should we be charging for? All right, those were the 4 ways I wanted to look at playing with your revenues. Let's look at a couple ways of playing with your cost structure. Squeezing your supply chain. This is actually the one benefit of the Vietnam War, was that the container ship was really perfected during the 60s for the sake of taking material from here to there. The innovation wasn't the invention of the container, it was the standardization of, there had been 4 sizes, now there's 1 size. So the standardization allowed manufacturing in China to bring me my Kindle. It also reduced the cost of shipping anything because they had less, I don't know if they called it shrinkage, theft. They had, you took a lot of theft out of it. You also could ship not just electronics, but there's flowers in some of these things. There's perishables that because you could speed up the time that things work their way through the system, you could be selling things that earlier you hadn't been. Now, the big beneficiary of this, we're small beneficiaries of it. The big beneficiaries of it are all named Walton. So, but they were able to use sort of supply chain management to speed it up, to take costs out of the system, and also to squeeze their suppliers, to say, we need you to give it to us for 5% less than last year. So, this is like beating up on your staff members. It might be your equivalent. But thinking, what's the materials, what's the raw resources that I'm making use of? Can I work with the people that are providing them, both directly and up the chain, to make it better and faster and cheaper? Can I squeeze costs out of the system somehow that's win-win? Another way to take costs out is to do what Henry Ford did, to vertically integrate. Ford had a steel mill down the road from the car plant, just because he could make it cheaper. Now, not in the long run, but by removing the handoffs and removing the transportation and removing the negotiation, he was able to take costs out of the system. So thinking about what can we do up and down the supply chain is important. A&P did this. Everybody thinks the big success of A&P is just the large store. I've been in coffee shops that are bigger than this supermarket, this A&P supermarket from 1940. It wasn't just the size of the store. It was also the backwards integration with Ann Page products and 8 o'clock coffee. So Whole Foods is now doing the same thing. Now that they've locked us in, now it's a private brand so they can make money upstream. So think about this as if you were running the Pullman locomotive plant, and you could charge your singers rent for staying in the apartment. So just different ways of thinking. Don't do that for real. They'll hate you. But where can you take costs out of the system up and down? Completely and radically different is where can you find advantage by just stopping, not doing something? Everybody thinks, well, this is how we produce things. The Encyclopedia Britannica is one of the triumphs of Western civilization. 20 volumes of triumph in my TV room, oddly enough. How can you improve on the Encyclopedia Britannica? Well, you can improve on it by not printing it on paper. So once Microsoft said, now, we segment the market into 2 groups of people. There are some people who want information, and there are some people who want eye candy to impress their neighbors. That's not me. That's okay. And it turns out most people wanting an encyclopedia didn't care that it was on paper, on a book. And if you get out of the printing business, about 80% of your costs disappear. What is it that people are buying? They're buying information. So just because you had always been doing these steps doesn't mean the customers cared about it. So by removing many parts of that process, of the creation process, they're able to take their costs down drastically. But nothing lasts forever. At this point, Encarta is totally useless because somebody else came along and took out all the costs of making an encyclopedia and said, let's not pay people to write it, let's not pay people to edit it, let's not pay people to print it, to advertise it, to put it in boxes. Just make it so. So how do you compete with free? Britannica is limping along, Encarta. You can't compete with free if people are still providing the product that you need, but have taken out all the costs. It takes an understanding of what is it that people actually want. Earlier I said that it's a real pain that people pay you for what they value and not what it costs you. Well, Encarta has learned this the hard way, that their cost structure couldn't survive long term. So we've talked about revenues, we've talked about cost. The third leg on a business model is capital, is money, other people's money. Other people's money is, of course, the secret to any successful venture. And opera companies are as good as anybody. Many of you know the story about how Dell Computers was so successful during the last 15 years, beginning around 1995, with the Dell model, where the raw materials came in and they shipped the computer, an hour later, and they had no money in working capital. They had negative working capital because they collected from the stores before they paid their vendors. So they're in a situation where they didn't need working capital. Now, you guys have mastered this too. I know that many of you have negative working capital, and Michael Dell is quivering. But using other people's money, this is what entrepreneurship is all about. This is what business is all about. Can I leverage what it is that you've got? Well, a classic example of this is public stadiums. In Indianapolis, in Lucas Oil Field, $720 million stadium, and the public picked up 85% of it. So, that's a sweet deal if you can get it. So how can you get somebody else to build your infrastructure like that so that you don't need to? All right, so using other people's money is a classic. Finally, partnering with the customer, rethinking where the boundary is of what they're paying for and what you're paying for. Last night, when we were, many of you were there, when we were watching the sort of human clockworks, was that person in black, walked very slowly, moving the hands of time forward or backwards. I was thinking, I hope that's not union. I hope they're charging some soup to be doing that. So, how do you rethink the relationship with the customer where it's their time or it's their money that you're taking advantage of, where it becomes a partnership? One partnership that I think is splendid is community-supported agriculture, where you're making the agreement with the vendor, with the farmer, I'm going to buy a box of produce from you every week. And I know that there's different things from week to week. I know that turnips are in season every week. But I will commit to buying this box. And you've got a partnership that has, in many ways, reduced the risk and the exposure that the farmer has in providing the goods. So by having that agreement between customer and vendor, you're able to take costs out of the system and allow the spread, in this case, of agriculture. So we've talked about these different elements. We've talked about where you can innovate, the 4 pathways, the roads, and we've talked about how. Now, in simplest terms, if you want to remember, the 2 things to remember are, am I trying to look for opportunities with new customers or existing customers? Am I trying to look for opportunities with new offers or old offers? I can remember that. And similarly, am I trying to do something involving revenue? Am I trying to do something involving cost? Am I trying to do something involving capital? Those are all money related. They all involve customers, you notice? They all involve money. Those are critical elements of a business model. And if I hear people say, well, our company needs a new business model where we can get the trustees to have a higher minimum or something, that's not a new business model. A new business model is thinking about a radical redefinition of your business, possibly in a way that your competitors will be upset about. So none of this is easy. As I said before, it's easier to be the company that comes in from the outside and starts fresh. That's where a lot of innovation comes from. You didn't see GM making the $3,000 car. There's a lot of things that the established players are afraid of. They're afraid of cannibalizing their existing business. Hey, if we're selling a $3,000 car, nobody's going to buy the $35,000 SUV. They have fears of, political fears. Maybe the person who has the bright idea isn't the one in the organization who has the clout to get it done. Or maybe they had an experience that somebody tried this bright idea 32 years ago and it didn't work. You'd be surprised how long the memory is in an organization for something going wrong. So I was doing some work once with Coors Beer. And it's very interesting that until 1975, they had no debt on their balance sheet. It was family business, and there was no debt. And that prevented them from becoming a national distributor. They were just selling west of the Rockies. And that's why some of you remember Gerald Ford's family members were smuggling beer across state lines, which was highly illegal. The family specialized in things that were illegal and addictive. But the reason Coors couldn't go national was because they didn't have the money. And they didn't have the money because they decided we aren't going to have any debt. Why didn't they have any debt? Because 78 years earlier, in 1897, the brewery had burned down. And old man Coors, Adolf was the name, went from bank to bank in Denver saying, can you give me money to rebuild? I've got a good business, let's rebuild. No, the banks wouldn't give it to him. Put it up and then we'll lend you money after it's in place. And he swore something in German and, that put a curse on them and said he was never going to borrow money. All right, he was long dead, but that curse lasted in the company until 1975 when they finally dropped it, expanded it, responded to Miller Lite, and became a national brand. So when you're doing things inside existing organizations, there are often these obstacles you're not even aware of. Having the bright idea can run into resistance that seems like it's a cold, dead hand from the past on your neck. So I don't want to pretend that any of this is easy, and I don't want to pretend that I've got answers. But I do want to push you. I want to provoke you, because if you're going to make actual change, it's not just a matter of working harder. You remember in Animal Farm, the big dumb horse Boxer responded to everything by saying, "I will work harder. I will work harder." You guys are working hard enough as is. Working harder is not always the answer. If you're just working harder, it might mean you're not changing anything. I have a college-age daughter who's not graduating, but she sent me one of those graduation letters that floats around the internet, from somebody, and he wrote this note to, letter to a young graduate. And his advice, actually, I think is relevant for us. He said, live your life like it's a novel. Pay attention to when you're getting bored with the main character. And don't be afraid to walk out of your own movie. So think about when is it worthwhile to upend what's going on? In business, there's a famous case of Intel. In 1985, they changed their business totally. So the microprocessors, the x86s, Intel Inside, that didn't exist until the mid-'80s. What Intel was selling before that was dynamic random access memory, DRAM. Well, other players were coming in, the Japanese were making it, the price was going down, and they realized, the board, Andy Grove and the other people in the executive committee, decided, well, what should we do? Should we reinvest? Should we build the new plant to make the DRAM chips? Or should we just forget the business that we've built over the last 10 years and start fresh with microprocessors? And Andy Grove, in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, describes walking out of the boardroom and firing himself and saying, all right, I'm going to come in as if it's a completely new case. If I'm the new guy in the company and I'm looking at the business situation, I'm looking at the opportunities, I'm looking at the assets, what could we do? What do we need to do? What do I do if I'm brand new? And so that instance of firing yourself enabled Andy Grove and the other leaders there to completely walk away from the business that they built and start a new one. Another way of thinking that is your house burns down and you get an insurance check. Well, you could rebuild the house exactly the way you would, but you know what? You probably wouldn't. What would you do if you got that insurance check and if you got that second chance? That's what Andy Grove gave himself. And there'll be moments, there'll be opportunities where it's the right thing for you to give yourself that opportunity as well. What do I do if I can fire myself? What can I do if I can cash the insurance check? What do I do if I'm the new kid on the block? So that's my graduation day advice for you, is that you've got these opportunities, and there are times where you really want to take it, and I wish you luck in doing that. So, thank you. Now, I wanted to come out in the audience and get some help from you to apply some of these ideas to what we've been doing. I don't want your advice. Let me see. Here, could you introduce yourself?
Bill Floresky from the Florentine Opera.
Up to the stage.
Okay.
So let me see. Let me get some. So, Bill, what I'm going to do is I want you to. You've got about 30 seconds here, and I'm going to vamp. Okay.
Okay.
All right, and then describe, based on the past 45 minutes, what you need to do with your strategic planning your opera. So, okay. I need somebody else. Here, your name is?
Tori Allen with Anchorage Opera.
Okay. Can you do this too? I've got them. Let's, come on. Let's pretend we're on Oprah. I'm Oprah. Come on, she wouldn't put up with a set like this.
All right.
So I want to get your reactions. This was a plan. I want to get your reactions to what we've been talking about and find out first what you're going through. You know, how's your life look right now? Is it ugly? Is it beautiful? Is it hopeful? Is it more hopeful than it was 45 minutes ago? So tell us what's up at Florentine.
It's all of the above. It's ugly, and it's you know, we've had to trim budgets because of endowments and all of that, but we've chosen to use that as an opportunity. And some of the things you've talked about in the last 45 minutes, we were playing with. I mean, I think it's a combination of you know, old customers and old products, and new customers and new products, and trying to fuse those two things simultaneously.
New customers, where are you finding them? Bus stations or?
No, I'm expanding our demographic or geographic and also age demographic by not only the new products that we're doing, new operas, but also new ways of doing old operas.
Cool. What about in Anchorage?
A little bit of everything you've just talked about. I had inherited a situation where we were operating at a 20% deficit for 20 years, 20% of our annual budget. And,
let me do the GDP calculation.
And I went out into the community to business leaders, to elected officials, and the message was, we're no longer going to tolerate from the opera that ticket sales only cover 45% of the cost of producing an opera. You have to figure out a way to make the ticket sales cover 90 to 100% of the cost of producing the opera. We're not going to support you unless you can make that happen.
If you can make that happen, why do you need them to support you?
Well, actually, it's been good because it's forced us into a new way of thinking, and I think we're going to be very close to making that happen.
So what's new? What's the new way of thinking? There's a 60s song like that.
Well, we had to rethink what it means to be an opera community, an opera company in a community like Anchorage. Anchorage is a population of 300,000.
That includes Vassala?
Yeah, I think Palin could see us from her house. A little more than 300,000. I noticed when I traveled around the countries, a lot of communities had opera houses, and the function of an opera house in those communities was to provide entertainment, not just opera. I think 100 years ago, you may have had Lily Pons come and do a concert. You may have had them put on a production of Rigoletto by an Italian opera company. You may have also had the local vaudeville company come through. And so we've had to adopt that kind of idea, and we do have a presenter in Anchorage, but we had to say what's different about this company is that we produce, we design, manufacture, and produce. We hire local people. 98% of the money that we make goes right back into the community, and that's what's different about us. We are the Opry House of Alaska.
The Opry House.
Right, and we give that folksy kind of feel.
So, would this work at Florentine?
Well,
are people folksy there?
Well, they're
cheeseheads, right?
Yeah. The folks, I mean, unfortunately, one of the things we have to work around are fixed costs that have to do with unions and the fact that we don't own our production house, but what we have opened is our own production center so that we can rent out to other groups in town and things like that. So we knew we couldn't change one fixed cost, but so where we can't change the fixed cost, we've tried to address other parts of it to hit those.
So I have a question. If your predecessors from 20 years ago showed up at your desk and said, oh, what are they doing? Would they recognize it? Would they think it was all that different? I mean, you've got the headaches of raising money, of temperamental stars, of audiences, of people getting old. What, is anything really that different? Or are we going to be doing a Groundhog Day with this same speech 30 years from now?
Well, actually, John Gage is here somewhere, so he could actually come up and tell me. I think that he would certainly recognize part of that because in a lot of ways there are a lot of very good things in place. But I think he and his predecessor before me would agree that it's we've gone from the economy has gone from making us think about things purely evolutionary to actually also thinking of it in a deconstructive way. And I think that since both those gentlemen are in new jobs and would recognize that, I think they would understand what we're going through and be supportive of that.
All right, so tell me more about deconstructive, because I'm having visions of Jean-Paul Gaultier here, and I don't think that's where you're headed.
No. For instance, we were traditionally what's called an opera in a box company. We rented in sets. We did 19th century opera, and that was by and large our stock and trade. Now we do a combination of things. We are doing new and newer works. We're building a lot of our own productions. We've rented them out, so we have income from our own productions that we never had. So we had to deconstruct what we used to do and build something new in terms of literally and figuratively build something new.
Yeah. What about, are you doing new productions on a regular basis?
We do our new experimental stuff in the format of a concert presentation, a multimedia concert presentation that costs us about a quarter of what it normally costs to produce a full opera.
And the ticket price?
Ticket prices are the same. The two
Full price, 25% cost structure.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah. The big changes for us, if someone were to come back now, we had 21 full-time employees 20 years ago. We now have 3 full-time and 8 part-time. The staff is project-driven. They seem to prefer that. Here's your specific task. This is what we expect of you. You don't have to report your hours, but this is the mission, and this is your part of this mission, and we know if it's being done or not. Also, we have a strategic plan that calls for it will not be okay within the next 2 years to ever have a deficit, to ever produce anything that's going to lose money.
That's risky, because that makes you sound like a state government, with...
Well, I think I'm dealing with some history here, and that is my board and the leaders in the community are very tired of an opera company that's always losing money. The investment class in Alaska and Anchorage is no longer willing to support that kind of an engine. The curious paradox is that the better we come about our pricings and our fiscal control, the more we're attracting that money back into our world.
Could you ever build up such a big endowment that you didn't need to raise money? Or at what point would people scream and say, you have enough money and I'm not giving you any more? This is fantasy here. Yeah, just enjoy the moment.
When I moved to Alaska, I had all of these pie-in-the-sky ideas. Next year we're producing South Pacific. I never thought I'd move to Alaska to produce South Pacific. I come from an but we had to adopt this new model. There were some opera purists in the state who were very angry. Some actually called me and they were going to pull their funding. And they thought it was an artistic decision. And I had to meet with them and explain to them, this is absolutely not about artistic ideas. This company has to live under a different way.
So you didn't try to justify the repertoire as being semi-operatic, with Enzio Pinza's contract that he would sing less than 15 minutes a night. Clock it, that's the role.
No, for us it was, look, we produce an opera that's going to lose $100,000, or we venture over into this new area and we make $400,000, and we just have to accept that for a few years.
So actually, just South Pacific does have a connection with Alaska. And
absolutely.
My grandfather, during World War II, worked on the Alaska Highway, which was very important in getting supplies out.
The first off-Broadway production of South Pacific was done in Kodiak Island by a military group. The second off-Broadway production, in 1953, was done in Anchorage. 6 sold-out performances.
Everybody went.
Well, just to give you some numbers, we have a presenter in town, the Anchorage Concert Association. They present Broadway shows, and they normally sell anywhere from 25 to 85,000 tickets. And for nearly 50 years, we're going on our 50th anniversary, especially the last 10, the opera's been happy if we sell 2,800 tickets. So we just look, obviously there are people out there, 85,000 people who are willing to pay for something that they want. And why are we fighting against the stream?
So answer his question. Why do you think they're giving him a hard time?
Because it's your core audience. I mean, that part of the problem, I think traditionally the core audience, even if they're a small percentage in terms of bodies, have represented the largest amount of contributed income. So and that's I think that's one of the challenges as we attract younger audiences, that a small group of people in terms of numbers can dictate because they have such a big impact on the contributed income.
So let's get straight. What's the business model here? It's one of two things. Either you're leveraging money from your donors to present in order to sell tickets to the masses, or alternatively you're getting hoi polloi through the door so that you can hit people up for big checks. You know, which one is primary and which one is secondary? The example here is in the magazine world, where magazines, you can get them, you can get most magazines for a $10 subscription because they just want to add you to the revenue base. There's some that are the opposite, but most magazines, they give it away in order to sell advertising. That's the equivalent of this. Or Google, has a complicated business model where you don't pay them for search. Google makes its money from those ads that you see. So they're a magazine too, and they had to think, who are we serving and who are we charging? And they're different models. So if you go on Google's website right now and do a search for worst oil spill ever or something, the link, the sponsored link that comes up at the top of the page is bp.com, what we're doing. So Google found this opportunity to sell ad space to British Petroleum whenever you do a search on environmental disaster. So, all right, so which is the chicken and which is the egg? Which of the two audiences, which is the enabler and which is the target? Which one do you want to see double?
I think it's like 2 points that are, the chicken and the egg are going toward each other. And I think it's a balancing act of trying to, at least in my situation, since we have a big Broadway presenter and we also have another opera company in town, we have to sort of navigate a road. But I think it's two, and I think the challenge are those two things are going to intersect, where we have a larger audience that's growing because we are getting younger audiences, but they have less ability for the contributed side. So we really have to address the earned income side because those two lines are going to cross each other.
Right. And you're almost all earned income. That's what you're about.
We're moving that way. We have to.
So what are you guys afraid of? Who are the competitors that either do or could exist? Earlier, I was giving lots of examples of companies that came in and shook it up. In 1999, Blockbuster, the annual report on Blockbuster had a page that said, "We see continued opportunities for growth in our core business." Yeah, right. Who are the people that could come in and screw up your life? Or are they there already?
Well, the knee-jerk answer is the Met HD broadcast. But what we've found by surveying those is that those are people who are already coming to us. So that's really not it. I think it's any variety of entertainment options, because in Milwaukee, the same people who go to the opera also go to the Packers and they go to the Milwaukee Bucks. So it's other entertainment choices. The discretionary income pool is what we're fighting against, not necessarily the HD broadcast. So I think we have to look outside of the performing arts box and across the whole discretionary income box.
Yeah. Who are you afraid of?
I'm afraid of our old business model. I think that's our worst enemy. I think as long as we position ourselves as a producer that employs up to 200 people in the community, that the 98% of the money goes right back into the community, that we're self-sufficient, I think we'll enjoy all the support we need.
So when I look at other industries, when I look at, say, movies, the movies have been through quite an up and down, and the trend in the last decade really, has been blockbusters, that is what the studios live and die on. Lord of the Rings, right? What's the role of blockbusters in your businesses? Is that what you're organized around? Is that essential for your long-term success, or is that the biggest threat that you've ever heard of?
I think it's the antithesis of what we do. And I have some colleagues out here who I've sort of looked to what they're doing in their companies, and I think that what some of us are finding in regional operating way is that you put a TOSC out there, but then you also put out an upward gantry, and you find out that the numbers aren't any different. And actually the composition of those audiences leans toward the new work. And so I'm only 100 miles from the Chicago Lyric Opera, so me doing
that's a big market for you.
It is, we are attacking Chicago, but not with Tosca because they're doing Tosca. So what we're finding now is doing other things is actually attracting a lot more interest from Chicago by doing that. So it's a very pragmatic as well as artistic choice.
Yeah. So what's a blockbuster in Anchorage? Is there a ring cycle in our future?
Good question.
No, it wasn't.
The Alaska Native version of the ring cycle. That would work. I don't think so. It's a little different. You know, there's the shipping service and the postal service considers Alaska a different country. So it's a very different situation up there. Yeah.
Well, you both talked about new work. How important is, we're used to telling ourselves, well, new work is important to the long-term survival of the art form. And I'm reminded of the scene with snakes in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the British guy goes, snakes, very dangerous indeed. You go first. Is that the right strategy for new works? Then there's the snakes in the plane attitude towards new work.
I don't think so. In the last session we were talking about this. I think that I think dealing with new work, because the sort of the guaranteed winners have shrunk in terms of what those pieces are, and if you're a small,
guaranteed winners in existing repertoire.
In existing repertoire, and if you're a company that does 3 or 4 productions a year, your rotation can only,
it's a decade long.
Right. So new work and getting people to sort of react to what you do in a more of a theater model, which is trusting what you do as a company as opposed to trusting what you do based on the piece you do, is what we're trying to develop, because I think that's where the salvation lies, not in trying to, because we're not going to get Renee Fleming to come and do Traviata for us.
She's doing rock.
Right.
Maybe you could get her to do it.
But, so I think it's really creating a brand that people will trust.
Yeah. What about in Alaska?
I would love to do new works. A couple of things. I think that it would be great if we could get the community of composers to, I don't know if they understand this, but maybe speaking out of turn, but if composers can begin to think about composing for regional opera houses, compose in such a way that smaller companies can produce these new works so that they're affordable. There seems to be this feeling now that amongst the major composers that they have to write for the major houses, and there has to be millions of dollars involved in a long process. And can we go back maybe a couple hundred years and imagine that we're in a village in Italy and you're composing something and that it can be rolled out by a small opera house for low costs? That would be great. Or would they consider changing their big productions so that smaller companies can produce them in an affordable way? I would love to produce some of the big things that appear at the Met or at Chicago, but it's just impossible. And why does it have to be impossible? Can you rethink this for the smaller community?
So could you imagine, seriously, a version of Dead Man Walking in your budget for your audience?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I've seen big pieces do this. There's a piece I think just last week, Tobias Picker, Emmeline, that I was incredible to find out that there was a small theater in Petaluma, the Cinnabar Theater, 100 seats, putting on this production, and I was really curious about it. Isn't that great that they've taken this major production and packaged it in such a way that a small theater in Northern California can produce it? And if there could be more of that kind of thinking, I think that would be great. My community would know the difference between a Rigoletto or an Emmeline, as long as it's a good show with good singing and good directing and good acting.
But you need a business model that works. So doing it, saying, well, it's going to cost $5 million, so we need to knock on more doors and twist more arms. That's the sort of, supersize approach, or the box or the horse, I will work harder. That's not a new business model, and that's not going to click.
That makes it impossible. I think a lot of composers shoot themselves in the head when they think in this way. It's just crazy.
Mm-hmm. So what I wonder about is where's the Sundance Festival of New Works, and how do you do new works in a way that there could be the Sundance Channel? I mean, there's people that are interested in it, but they might not be in your community. They might not be. We might need to reach people who aren't your existing customers in order to support new work. So how can you have a business model that supports innovation, newcomers, et cetera?
Well, regional opera, I mean, if you look across the map of opera in America now, it's fascinating what regional companies, Fort Worth just did a world premiere. Nashville's been very committed to that. Minnesota has for a long way. And I know that Mark is committed to having funds there for general directors to go and see things. So I think I don't think you have to build a new laboratory. I think a lot of regional opera companies have become that laboratory. It's getting access to that, and if it's through immediate HD, which are some of the other things we've talked about. I think that's where the laboratories are, and I think that's how it's going to happen.
But can you say, look, instead of $1 million or $500,000, roll this out in such a way so that it can be produced for $150,000.
Mm-hmm. That's what we just, the earlier session today, we talked about that for about an hour and a half, and that was that. And certainly Daniel Catan is a big proponent of trying to make that work, and I know many others are.
Well, also the idea of taking big things and making them small. That's on Broadway right now. That's the rage with take Sweeney Todd from the big show to the little show. And if you can get the soprano to play tuba, God bless you. I'd like to thank our two guests, Tory Allen and Bill Forescu.
Thanks, Bill.
Wonderful sports.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I'd like to thank all of you for sitting through this long session as we talk about business model innovation. My observation is everybody talks about it and people get cold feet. Everybody apparently wants to go to heaven and nobody wants to die. I do know, though, that everybody wants to go to lunch. So with that, Mark, let me give you back the microphone. Thank you again.